Hello, I'm Tony Goldstone, and in this video I'm going to talk about the Advanced and Hokey Input tab, which is one of the advanced tabs. But just before I go to that tab, I'm just going to recap some of the values in one of the basic tabs, which is the Change Analyze tab. So you'll remember this is our default model, and our consultant, if we were using self-pay, would have paid around £350,000 in tax and would have got a pension of 78,754. And of course that needs to be adjusted for inflation, so it's around £51,000. But if we remember that value of 78,754, and conversely, if we then highlight the scheme pays option, this consultant would have had that £350,000 converted into a loan with interest of around £488,000, which would have led to a pension reduction, leaving a pension of 57,470, which is worth around £37,000 in today's terms. And you can see by default that's the same value as in the Advanced and Hokey tab. And that's because by default the Advanced and Hokey tab shows the same as the scheme pays all. So if we just remember those two values, so scheme pays was 57 and self-pay was 78. So if we go back via our table of contents, and we can now open the Advanced and Hokey Input tab. So essentially the Advanced and Hokey Input tab only has two columns of data entry. So we've got a so-called hokey option, which allows us to model the effect of coming in and out of the scheme, hence the name hokey or hokey cokey. And then we've also got a column which looks at how you're paying that tax. So by default there's a whole range of zeros in there because I've set this to say scheme pays currently, which means that any tax charges, and the tax charges are shown here in this orange column of P, have been paid as a scheme pays loan. So you can see that initial value of 10,657 for tax has gone onto our loan account the following year, and then that accumulates all the way up to that loan, if you remember, of £488,000, and then that led to that pension in this last column here of 57,470. So in some ways this sheet can be used just to show exactly the same information as the other two models, scheme pays and self pays. So if we click the down arrow here and we change it from scheme pays to self pay, and we can now see that all of these tax values for the annual allowance charges in this orange column here in P now appear in values in H. Those values are exactly the same, and then that becomes equivalent to the self-pay model, and you can see that that comes back to that same pension we saw before of 78,754, not reduced for inflation. So that shows a simplified model of every year being treated in the same way, using either all self-pay or all scheme pays. But it may be that you want to use a mix and match approach. So for example, if we just change it to a default of scheme pays, it might be, for example, in this year, if your £657,000 loan, let's say you wanted to pay £5,000 yourself, and then that allows you to pay some of that yourself, and then only the remainder. So this consultant had a tax charge of 10,657. If you paid 5,000, then the remaining 5,657 would have gone on a scheme pays loan. And if we want to go back to being controlled by this top cell with the arrows, if we just select one of the cells above it, and then that will copy the formula back to get rid of that manual override. So that's column H, which shows the amount of tax paid, which you can by default have all as scheme pays or self pays, or you can put in a manual value if you want to pay some of the tax in 1 year or none of the tax in 1 year, in any combination that you wish. And we then come across to the hokey options. And as I said, one strategy for dealing with the tax is to come in and out of the scheme. And just before we get onto that column, I'm just going to flip back to one of the other sheets that we saw earlier. So if I click now on the Growth and Hokey tab, you may have noticed that one column which I didn't discuss was column N, which is the so-called optimal hokey months predictor. So you'll recall that our pension input amounts are based on constant growth from the 2015 scheme, and then you can see that these peaks of growth when there's pensionable pay increases, and that pension pressure comes from the 1995 scheme in particular, and if it's the 2008 scheme, those pension growths are spread over 3 years. Now, by coming in and out of the scheme, we can proportionally reduce our 2015 growth. So, for example, if we see here, in this year of 18-19, the consultants got a relatively small tax charge of £2,024, and that means that he could potentially abate that tax charge by coming in and out of the scheme to reduce his pension growth in that year. So this optimal hokey months predictor gives a rough indication, and it's important to note that it's exactly that. It's just a rough indication to show you the number of months that you can come out to try and minimise your annual allowance charge. And you'll see in some years it says full 12, and that means that you can stay in all 12 months without getting a tax charge. So that full 12 corresponds to that 0 tax charge there. And then in some years it says minimum 1, and that's because your pension growth has been large because of a pensionable pay rise. So these are the 5-yearly increments. And you can see that even only by going in for 1 month out of 12, that would just reduce that pension growth by 1/12, so £38,000. You would still be unable to completely get rid of the tax charge. So if we go back to the advanced and hokey option, so currently by default it's set to fully in, which means all of these are set to 12. So one of the options is suggest and tweak. And by clicking suggest and tweak, we can see that it's pulled in those suggested values from the other sheets. So if you just have a quick look at this column P, which was the tax charges, and I'll just go back to fully in. So you can see that this consultant had an annual allowance tax charge every year from 16-17. There were peaks with the pay awards, and then it just gets bigger and bigger with revaluation from the 2015 scheme. But if we go to suggest and tweak, it pulls in those values from the other spreadsheet, and then you can see that in most years we've managed to abate that annual allowance tax liability, and but there are still some tax liabilities in the years where this consultant has had a pay increment. Now, it's very important to realise that there's a number of consequences of hokey cokey. So we have come out of the scheme for part of the time, and although we've reduced our tax liability, we've therefore reduced our pension, because obviously we're not accruing in the time when we're out of the scheme. So if I just flick that back to fully in, so we can see fully in and using scheme pays, we had a pension of 57,470, and by using that full hokey, that pension has come down to 42,668. But the other side to the coin of having come out of the scheme and reduced our pension is that we will also get some of the employee contributions back. So to demonstrate this, I'm just going to change this to a value of 6, and this means that from 16-17 it's going to show 6 months in and 6 months out, just because it's easier to show the maths. So you can see when we do 6 months, 6 months in, 6 months out, we've got an equal value here for employee contribution. So that's going to be half of your 13.5% or half of your 14.5%, because you're only in for half of the year. But the remaining time you also get your employee contribution back, and that's irrespective of what your employer's policy is. If you're not contributing towards the scheme, you would get some of your employee contributions back in proportion to the number of months that you're out of the scheme. So because this is 6 months in, 6 months out, that recycled amount is equal in both. And it's important to realise that this is taxed income, and because this is taxed income, this will then interact in a fairly complicated way with the taper, because then that now adds back into both your threshold and adjusted income. But we've also got here a column which says recycled employer contributions, and by default it's set to no recycling, and what that means is that in the months that you're out of the scheme, your employer keeps your employee contributions, and that's against the BMA stance. We believe that all employers should recycle all of the employee contribution, less employees' national insurance. And if you change that to the BMA recycling policy, you can now see that in addition to getting the recycled employee contribution, you also get the employer contribution back after national insurance. And bearing in mind that that's completely cost neutral for the taxpayer. So that just comes out of the money that's already been set aside for your employer contribution, and the employee contribution is what you would have paid had you been full-time in the scheme. So now, for example, if we just change that back to the optimal suggestion tweak, so we can see that pension has come down to 43,725, but we've now got all of these employee contributions and all of these employer contributions. So you can see that this consultant would have amassed £647,000 of additional salary. Now that's a gross amount, and that obviously would be subject to tax and national insurance, but it also doesn't include any interest or investment opportunity for that money that could have been invested in a vehicle to grow and then give the consultant either income or a pot in retirement. And then just to illustrate it, if we turn that policy back to no recycling, so at the moment we've got a pot of additional salary of £647,000, and then if we turn that recycling off, you can see that's very much reduced. That's now come down to £314,000. So in summary, hokey is a strategy that enables you to reduce your tax, but in doing so there's several things to be aware of. One, that your recycled employee contributions will interact with the taper, so you need to be careful around threshold income and just take that into account. Obviously, by coming out of the scheme, you're reducing your pension accrual, which will mean that your pension may be lower. And also there are several features of the pension that are lost in the months that you're out of the scheme, such as reduced death in service and reduced ill health retirement benefit, and some of those are summarised in the user guide. Like some of the other sheets, there's also an age highlight that was set at 60 is the desired pension age, but you can set that to whatever you wish, just to highlight a line and make it easier to read. And that summarises the advanced and hokey input tab. Thank you.